Wake up, rethink the status quo. When you get your money right, then you're the one who runs your life. Come build a wealthy spirit with Sammie and Michelle.
Hey everyone! Today we are going to be talking about vulnerability. Being vulnerable can create deeper, longer lasting, and more enjoyable relationships. But it's not the easiest thing to do.
Sammie, I am not good at vulnerability at all. In fact, I think I've made a lot of big strides in the past couple years, but there was definitely a point in my life where it was difficult for me to share anything really personal about myself. And I'm excited to talk about this topic today, about vulnerability and making connections, because I think it's such an important part about building a community, building a wealthy spirit, because you're finding and connecting with like-minded people. And so for that reason, I think this is going to resonate with a lot of people.
Michelle, I appreciate you being vulnerable about how not vulnerable you were in the past. And I'm sure our listeners feel more connected to you because of that.
Thank you, Sammie.
Being vulnerable, it's how we connect with people. It's how we bond with people. But it's not easy to do. I think about when we started this podcast. Starting the podcast in itself is an act of vulnerability. Putting out your creative work into the world and saying, hey people, you like me?
I made this. I think it's worth listening to. It's very scary, and you really are opening yourself up to other people's judgment, what other people think. But something really cool about our podcast is that it's a great example about how vulnerability and opening yourself up, putting something out there, can actually help you build relationships. I think about all of the people that came back into our lives because they listened to our podcast and they thought, hey, I really relate to this and I want to tell you about that. They were vulnerable and shared how they felt.
Michelle and I, on this podcast, we've shared a lot of insights we've had from struggles that we've had or things that we've learned, things that were difficult. And apparently it was not for nothing, because now a lot of you guys have reached out to us and we feel closer to a lot of you for sharing what's going on with you and how you're responding to our content.
I agree, Sammie. I think about our friends, Abby and Karen.
Abby and Karen are great examples.
These are people who we went to high school with. They had started listening to the podcast, and I still remember Abby texting me that she binge listened to the podcast on a road trip. She said she was implementing all of these things. Over time, she's told me that she's checked the APY on her savings account. She drew action changes things on her whiteboard. She sent me different ways that she was working to be 1% better. She sent me a photo of her habit stacking brainstorm chart. And it's so crazy because we were open talking about these things that we were interested in. And then she was really open sharing that she, A, was listening, and B, was implementing it and sharing different ways that she was actually putting these things to work. And our friendship has grown so much in the last couple of years because of that.
Yeah, Abby was really vulnerable about how she's using the information and the fact that she's just even listening to the podcast that regularly. And I think because of that, we ended up meeting up with Abby and Karen in Joshua Tree. And we had an awesome weekend where Abby led us through a yoga session because she's doing yoga teacher training. Abby and Karen talked to us about what kind of conferences they're going to. Karen showed us her side hustle. I feel like we were all helping each other grow and learn about each other's experiences. And I think that's all because of the vulnerabilities that were being exchanged. By the same token, I have many friends who I was close to, but because we're, for one reason or another, not able to be vulnerable about what's going on with ourselves, those relationships have fizzled out.
It's true. Once I heard that vulnerability and connection are related, a light bulb went off. That totally makes sense to me. And I'm really excited to chat more about it today because I think it's something that if you can tap into, can really make your relationships deeper, more meaningful, and longer lasting.
Let's get into it.
But first, Sammie, I do want to talk about our partner, Riverside. As you all know, we were just talking about how we launched a podcast. It gave us the opportunity to share the things that we were thinking about, share how we're processing different things, really helped us on this goal to build a wealthy spirit. And Riverside has been there with us every step of the way. It's where we record our audio. It's where we record video. We love their tools because if there's any issues with the internet, they record everything locally. They give us 2 separate audio files, makes it really easy to edit. And now they even have some really cool tools like AI transcription, where you can actually get the transcript from the video by doing literally nothing extra. So if you're thinking about starting a podcast, a live stream, anything that requires video or audio recording, we highly recommend Riverside. And you can find a link to our partners in the show notes.
Back to today's topic, vulnerability and relationships. You might be thinking, what is vulnerability? Like, what is it truly? I really like this definition that Mark Manson talks about in a piece called Vulnerability in Relationships. He says, vulnerability is consciously choosing not to hide your emotions or desires from others.
His definition is so good, Sammie, and I actually really enjoyed his reflection on vulnerability in creating relationships. So we're definitely going to reference it again throughout this podcast. And also, we had to go to the queen of vulnerability herself, Brené Brown. We went back and listened to her original TED Talk on the power of vulnerability. And already something that I love that she talks about is why being vulnerable with others is worthwhile.
Brené Brown talks about how she interviewed multiple thousands of people, and she noticed that there were people who had a strong sense of worth or worthiness, and there were people who felt unworthy. And she's trying to find out what are the differences between these people. Do people feel worthy because they have a good job, or because they live in a certain neighborhood, or because they drive a Honda Fit? Why were these people feeling worthy? And
Sammie added in the Honda Fit. Turns out people who own Honda Fits feel worthy. Their sisters who are forced to deal with their maintenance issues do not.
Okay, to be clear, the maintenance issues are minor. What Brené found was that people who had a sense of worthiness, they were connected to other people because they were willing to be authentic. These people embraced vulnerability.
The thing that Brené Brown does really well is she gets down to the heart of why it's important to be vulnerable. Just like you're saying, Sammie, it's about this authenticity. It's about putting yourself out there and giving people the opportunity to recognize themselves in you, to recognize the things that they're dealing with, to recognize, for me, that I'm angry, tired, hungry, scared. These are all emotions that Sammie and I have talked through over the last year when I was like afraid of being vulnerable. And so instead of actually talking about it, I would just shut down and go into protest behavior. And luckily, Sammie is a lot better about vulnerability than I am. So she would actually come to me and say like, hey, like, can we talk about what's going on? Why did you just scream at me for not doing the dishes? I'm so sorry. And I'm like, it's not about the dishes. And she's like, I'm so confused. So it's just important, like having that open dialogue with Sammie lets us connect on things and also work through things because we're being more open about them.
Brené Brown points out that we have a hard time being vulnerable because we want to control and predict things.
Ooh, is that in the genes? Because that is in our family.
As a self-proclaimed freak de la control, control freak. As a self-proclaimed control freak, I have to say, when you're vulnerable, you don't know how the other person is going to respond. Sometimes if you do know how they're going to respond, it's less vulnerable because it doesn't matter. But like, let's say you're going to tell someone you love them for the first time. They might be like, cool. Or they might be like, oh, crap. We're reading the situation differently. Or maybe they'll be like, I love you too.
I love
you. The feeling is mutual.
Yes. You can't know ahead of time.
You can't know ahead of time. You absolutely cannot.
That is the hard part, Sammie. For example, again, back to the podcast and doing something creative. If we started this podcast and knew that 2 years down the line, we would still be going, we'd have 117, 118 episodes, I'm sure we would have had a lot less nervousness sharing it with people.
Mm-hmm.
We would have been like, guess what, guys? We got this bomb podcast coming through. But we had to wait. We had to share it with people. We had to get their feedback. We had to make changes. We had to grow over time. And all of that allowed us to build better relationships, allowed us to produce a better podcast. But it's hard to put something out there and just not know what the end result is going to be.
It's hard, so sometimes we avoid it. Maybe it's time for us to have a vulnerable conversation. Maybe we're in a vulnerable place, feeling some hard emotions, but we don't want to talk about it. What do people do instead of being vulnerable? A lot of things. They find ways to numb themselves.
Oof.
Sometimes numbing yourself can be eating a giant carton of ice cream with hot fudge on top.
On top of a chocolate cake.
On top of a warm chocolate cake.
A lava cake.
A lava cake.
Oof, gosh. You know what? We do not numb ourselves like that anymore. But if we did.
If we did, that would be the way. Maybe it's with alcohol. Maybe it's with drugs. Maybe it's being on social media or binge watching a ton of Netflix shows. We all have different ways of escaping the vulnerability.
And one thing I love that Brené Brown talks about is how when we're trying to numb a emotion, when we're trying to avoid being vulnerable, when we're trying to numb the sadness, the anger, the negative feelings, we don't get to selectively choose. You don't get to say, hey, my boss yelled at me today. I'm going to go and just shove my face with Chick-fil-A because they don't know what's going on. This has happened to me. What happens is you're actually numbing all emotions at once.
Exactly, Michelle. Maybe you really need to have a conversation with your partner about something difficult that's going on between you guys. But instead, you decided to binge watch Friends. Not only are you avoiding having to be vulnerable, but you're avoiding the future closeness that you would experience, the future joy that you guys would experience once you learn how to overcome the problem with each other. Or maybe it would be that future joy that you would experience once you're out of that crappy relationship with this boyfriend. Either way, it is being avoided, and instead you are seeing Rachel and Ross get together once again.
That's why I think Sammie staying in a toxic situation is so bad, for obviously a number of reasons. But the thing is that when you stay in a toxic situation, when I have been in, say, work situations where I know that the environment's not great, they're promoting a message that's very ego heavy, they are encouraging us to work long, long hours without compensating us, I'm getting upset, I'm going to happy hour with my coworkers, I'm drinking, I'm complaining. The additional reason why it's so bad to stay in these situations is because you're in a toxic situation, you avoid being vulnerable and dealing with the negativity, and then you go and you numb the negative emotions. Thus, you don't feel happy, you don't feel sad, you don't feel anything, and you go on living your life feeling unfulfilled and miserable.
So, how do we be vulnerable? The first one's easy. You tell people how you feel.
Sam, I want to tell you something. We were at McDonald's yesterday.
We were.
And let me tell you something. Something I have recognized about myself, and I have now expressed to Sammie, is that I'm honestly a pretty chill person. When I get fearful, I get very anxious. And I get kind of, I would say, snippy, rude, mean, etc.
It's true.
Yes, you might be thinking to yourself, what could possibly have happened at your local McDonald's?
We were at McDonald's, and there was a little order mishap, you could say. So the lady asked me to go move my car to stall 1, and they would bring out our order. I saw a car in front of me, and I said, "Where is stall 1?" Because there's no labels.
There's no stall. It's just the street it's just a driveway to the street.
She said, stall 1 is in front of that other car right there. So, first of all, I have a little bit of trouble getting around this car because there's just like a tight spot there.
We don't get around them, quite honestly.
Yeah, we barely get around them. Then I'm like right next to them, trying to see if I actually have enough room to pull my car forward in front of them. I notice it's two middle-aged women. They look jolly, well, perhaps a little too jolly for 10 a.m. in the morning, because they were both drinking Miller Lite. That's right, driver and passenger with an open can.
She literally at one point sticks her hand up the moon window and like taps out her cigarette. And I'm getting nervous because these people, they're a little bit rowdy, if I'm being honest. And I don't think it's a big deal about where we park because, once again, there are no real stalls. And I don't want to anger these people. We're barely getting around them. But Sammie is a rule follower.
Michelle doesn't think it's a big deal. Okay, but let me tell you, they said stall 1, and it's like, why would I just park where the other cars are supposed to get out? I'm like, I need to be in stall 1. So I pull in front of this lady who's clearly intoxicated while driving at McDonald's.
And not happy, okay? Then we get a lot of attitude from them.
Yeah, I can tell she's not happy because I look in my rear view mirror and I see her put up her hands and kind of crinkle her brow and mouth the words, "What the f-?"
Also, who cares? It's not like we're cutting in line at McDonald's. It doesn't even make sense to me.
I'm like, I'm not trying to steal your food, okay? I just had to go to stall 1 like they told me.
Anyway, what happens is that Sammie and I start fighting because I'm upset, because I'm nervous. Okay, people in our town, they're very good people. But it's a type of place where people are prepared to have fights if needed, okay? Especially if they're maybe drinking and driving at the local McDonald's at 10 in the morning.
My only fear was that she would let go of the brakes and accidentally hit my car. At which case I would just say, don't worry about it. I'll buy a new car. Like, it's fine.
Meanwhile, I'm saying maybe we should leave. Who cares about our McDoubles? Okay.
Yeah, so Michelle was getting really angry and she's like, maybe we need to just leave. I did not know where this was coming from. She was just kind of like yelling at me to like get out and leave. And I could tell she was getting angry.
Yes, but because we've had this conversation before, I said, you know what, Sammie? I'm really upset and angry, and I'm sorry that I'm reacting this way. I think it's because I'm really scared.
Mm-hmm.
I guess middle-aged drinking women inside their car make me nervous.
It didn't make me nervous, if I'm being honest. But
okay, in my defense, they did get angry, drive around us, go back into the McDonald's. So, like, the situation was escalating. Like, I'm not crazy.
For some reason, I didn't feel threatened. But Michelle and I have talked before, and I do know that when she gets angry, a lot of times it's because the emotion that she's not expressing is actually fear.
Mm-hmm. And the thing about Sammie is she actually lacks the fear bone. I think she gets it from my mother. And so I have to be extra fearful when I'm around her. You know, sometimes we go on a hike and we get lost. Sometimes we go somewhere and we have no snacks. I have to be diligent. And yeah, we did have a fight, but I expressed that and we got our McDonald's. We drove away. We were a little bit nervous. We did forget to get gas, so we had to circle back, but not a big deal. We survived. The point is, tell people how you feel.
Yes, by Michelle previously sharing with me that her fear oftentimes presents as anger, which we found out through conversations, me and her are now a lot closer. I can recognize that when she starts getting a little testy, a little feisty, she's probably afraid of something. And then I think to myself, what could she be afraid of? And then I know what she's thinking. And she didn't have to think to herself, oh, it's lame to be afraid of two middle-aged women with a Miller Lite. No, she thought, you know what, it's okay. Let me share that I am very uncomfortable in this current situation.
Exactly. And Sammie, being the loving, caring sister that she is, said, oh my God, I think they're following us.
It was a joke and it was not funny. And I should never have done that. I'm very sorry.
This is, you know, check who you're being vulnerable with. Siblings may be a gray area. But the really simple but not necessarily easy thing to do is to tell people how you're feeling, whether it's angry, scared, sad, usually a negative emotion, but maybe a positive one. Whatever is your vulnerability tick, I don't know. Express it.
Yes, express it. And you might not even have it fully worked out, but then you can have the conversation with that person so that you guys can figure out what's really going on.
Another thing that I liked that Mark Manson talked about for how to be vulnerable was admitting that you're weak in an area. which made me thought of this idea of embracing a beginner's mind. What he's talking about is, let's say you're new at a job, or you're playing tennis for the first time, or you're learning how to do the piano. If you are willing to go to somebody and say, hey, I'm not good at this. Can you help me? That vulnerability will give people the opportunity to connect with you, and you might actually find somebody who can help you and make you better.
You know, Michelle, I really respect when people can admit that they are weak in an area, and it honestly does make you want to help them more.
I agree, Sammie. I actually think about my last job when I was worried about getting fired, which I was eventually.
See, not an unvalidated fear.
Yeah, 100%. But once I embraced the fear, I was a lot less angry. But I realized when things were looking bad that I was actually not doing that well, honestly. Like, my performance was low. I was like, whatever is going on in the greater office, I can admit that I'm not the best or the second best, arguably the worst. But because I was able to admit that, I went to our sales trainer and I was like, hey, can you listen to my calls and give me feedback? He did. He would go through every minute and say, hey, I noticed that you asked the client immediately what the budget was. Why did you do that? And we could work through those things. I talked to our solutions architects, our engineers, and I said, hey, I don't really understand what this product does. Can you explain it to me? And they walked through everything with me. They went on the whiteboard. They drew diagrams. And soon I started to get better. I went from being one of the worst to one of the most knowledgeable. And it was because I was finally willing to just admit, hey, I suck. I don't know what's going on. Can you help me? And that's a huge thing for vulnerability.
Another way to be more vulnerable is to take responsibility.
This is such a good one, Sammie.
I think for me, when it comes to taking responsibility, I definitely think about me and my jobs. At my last job, I was in a really chaotic environment. We were constantly understaffed in like every department, and everything always just seemed to be going wrong. So it was just very difficult to work there. And so I got a new job.
After 5 years.
So after a short 5 to 6 years, I got a new job. And in my new job, like, so many things are exponentially better. But I still spend a lot of time working on my charts. And now I initially started with not so many patients. Now I have a ton of patients. And all my waking hours are once again going to my job. This time I really had to look at my work and admit to myself, with all my hours going to my work and feeling drained out after work, I was once again feeling a bit disgruntled. But this time I had to look at the situation and I had to admit to myself that there are a lot of aspects of this type of job that I just don't like. Yes, I really don't like having to spend all my waking hours doing work because it gives me no time for me. But also, I'm completely emotionally exhausted at the end of the day after talking to people about their problems all day. And sure, there's a lot of things I do like about my job, but this time I really had to take responsibility and be like, hey, like, I'm not going to do this kind of work forever.
I really like that, Sammie, because something I often think to myself is that I am the common denominator to my problems. In your situation, you're switching jobs, you're still having issues. It's better to address, like, maybe this career isn't the right fit for you. For me, I have this conversation with myself with relationships. If I'm having the same problem with men that I'm dating, if I'm like, they're having communication issues, we never talked about this. It's time for me to recognize I'm the common denominator. I also have communication issues. I'm not a very vulnerable person. And it takes a little bit of vulnerability to actually look at yourself and say, I'm the problem. But then it also gives you the power to say, okay, how can I fix this? How can I go to therapy and talk through these issues? How can I take a look at what my common mistakes or common negative patterns are? And are there ways for me to change them? It gives you the opportunity to actually make changes so that you have a happier, more fulfilled life and are making more meaningful connections with the people around you. People who take ownership over their problems are always going to have better relationships at the end of the day.
For me, I spent a majority of my adult life working towards this. So to admit in some way that this didn't align, it is a hugely vulnerable thing for me to do. I think sometimes it can actually be easier for me to share how I'm feeling and be vulnerable about that. But to be vulnerable about my career for some reason is much more difficult.
I think part of that too, Sammie, is because it's going to mean that you're going to take a risk. You're going to change your career. You're going to do something different. And that to me is also a very vulnerable thing, because it's always the person, the critic, who lacks vulnerability, who doesn't take the risk, who's all about judging other people, judging the job, judging their relationships with other people. They're not being open. They're not saying like, hey, if there are so many other things in my life, if I'm criticizing all of these things, like, is it that everything is the problem? Or is there something that I myself need to take a look at? And that's not easy to do, because it's something you have to do many times in your life, I think.
The thing about vulnerability, Michelle, is there is power in vulnerability.
Ooh, yes.
The more we put ourselves out there, the more we grow. The more that we can admit that we have done something wrong, or that we are weak, or that we are experiencing difficult emotions, or that we're responsible for a situation that is not great, the more we can change and grow.
Yes, something I loved that Brené Brown said is that vulnerability is the birthplace of joy, creativity, and belonging. And it's true, because if you are willing to lean into the negative emotions, then you can also lean into the positive emotions. If you're willing to put yourself out there, take risk, show people who you really are, you're opening opportunity to make meaningful connections, have authentic relationships, and experience more joy and belonging as well.
Takeaways.
Takeaways for today's episode. Why be vulnerable? Vulnerability helps create authentic connections. It's also saying, this is who I am, and I am worthy.
Yes. And we often avoid being vulnerable. We often avoid those negative feelings by numbing ourselves using alcohol, drugs, social media, television, all of these things that will turn our brains off to the negative emotions. But we can't just selectively numb those emotions. We also numb the positive feelings like joy and happiness. If we can't express and lean into the negative, we can't connect and find joy in those situations either.
So, how to be vulnerable? Tell people how you feel instead of hiding those things. Embrace a beginner's mind. Admit if you are weak in a certain area so that others can help you grow. Take responsibility. Part of vulnerability is recognizing that you are the common denominator in all parts of your life. If your work or your relationships make you unhappy, take steps to recognize that and test ways to improve them.
And the best thing is that there's power in vulnerability. The more you put yourself out there, the more you grow, the more you're able to experience joy, creativity, and belonging. And most importantly, the real key that we want to highlight today is that vulnerability will help you connect with people you are meant to connect with, because it allows you to be authentic, to be real, and to have self-worth, to say, this is me, and I am going to be me, and I'm going to share myself, and I don't know how you're going to react. I can't control that, but at the least, I am being authentic to myself.
That's right, Michelle. Part of building a wealthy spirit is building a community and deepening those relationships in your life. We don't just want money and time for no reason. We want it to be able to really connect with the people around us. And in order to do that, we have to be vulnerable.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to do that is to start a podcast, share all your feelings, and then see which of your friends stick around.
Community time.
Before we say goodbye, it's our community time.
And in the spirit of being vulnerable, I wanted to share something very toxic that's been going on in my life. And that is my toxic multinodular goiter.
Okay, you might have to explain that one.
I have been going to the Mayo Clinic, and I know what you're thinking. This girl is so extravagant. But it's kind of like, if I have to drive 2 hours to go to the doctor anyway, I might as well go to the Mayo Clinic.
I think it's a very specific audience that's going to think you're bougie for going to the Mayo Clinic. But considering that like half our listenership is in healthcare, I guess it's fine to caveat that.
At the Mayo Clinic, as they have told me multiple times, they call the toxic multinodular goiter plumber's disease.
Is that because plumbers get it?
No, Michelle. It's because Dr. Henry Plummer was a Mayo physician. He was the Mayo physician who discovered the toxic multinodular goiter.
Wow.
So I have been dealing with goiter issues for a long time, and previously I was having biopsies like every year on these nodules that look suspicious. But one visit at the Mayo and a nuclear medicine scan was ordered. I learned about nuclear medicine scans for the thyroid in school. I tried to order one once I graduated, and nobody knew where that could be done. Turns out it's the Mayo Clinic. So I took this pill, and they do the scan on my thyroid, and they can see if these nodules light up or don't light up. Mine lit up like a Christmas tree. It was pretty cool. You know, people came in the room to look at the scans.
Oh, God.
I was like a little show and tell there. But yes,
Don't know if I'd be thrilled if that happened.
my goiter is a little bit toxic. And this week I saw the ENT surgeon and I will be having surgery. Even the ENT appointment was a little bougie. He handed me this mirror, which reminded me of a handheld looking glass. And I was like, oh, what's this for? And then I was actually supposed to use the mirror to then look at my thyroid in the mirror, as he told me where he would be cutting me open and what the scar would look like.
Oh, God.
I was like, this is so extra.
Why?
You know, just so that you feel like you know what's going to happen to you.
I guess that's true. I guess you don't want to go under, come out and be like, what the heck did you guys do? Which actually I think happens to people. Like a lot of people go in and they don't know what's going on. So in that sense, I appreciate it.
Yeah, not at the Mayo Clinic. You will know what's going to happen. And Michelle and I, we actually stayed at the Residence Inn at the Mayo Clinic because they have a hotel connected to the Mayo Clinic. And this place was also bougie.
If you can't tell that Sammie hasn't taken a vacation in a while.
All my PTO is going to figuring out what's going on with my thyroid right now. So it's been a lot of fun. This hotel was nice, okay? It's one of those hotels that have like a kitchen and everything. And they even had a scrub mama. Right, not just a regular sponge. They could have got a Dollar Tree sponge. No, they got a scrub mama that you could take home with you because I'm assuming they're not going to reuse it.
We took it home with us.
we took it home with us. And they had tons of toppings, like literally 8 different topping options for the oatmeal in the morning. So overall, great experience. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10.
It might not surprise all of you to hear that everyone else there was 80 years old, and we were the only people.
Vivacious there.
And us and the snowbirds were getting excited about the free breakfast and all the toppings for the oatmeal, which were sorted into sugary treats and healthy options, which I appreciated.
So if you've got a freak show disease that you're trying to figure out, the Mayo Clinic is not a sponsor of this podcast, but I highly recommend them.
If they sponsor things. But yeah, I also don't think you can just like pick and choose. So anyway, shout outs from our community. As you know, we did our Bachelorette episode a couple episodes ago, and I actually shared it with the group chat for my friend Pooja's Bachelorette. Great feedback. People loved it. Julia said, LOL, my soundbite. Get your flirt on. Not budget related at all, but I still think sound advice. Pooja said, fave quote, she's been my friend for 10 years. And the little emoji with the little eyes that seem filled with tears and happiness. Aww. Twinkle said, hee, I love the shout out to the color coordinated spreadsheets. She's the one that organized it with Subira. They killed it. And she also said when she was done, Michelle, this was amazing. Loved this. Heart eye emoji, heart eye emoji, heart eye emoji. So that was awesome because a lot of them were so generous and gave us clips, which Sammie was so much fun. I thought that was such a cool, different way to create an episode.
Yes, Michelle. It reminded me a lot of my favorite NPR, which I know you despise.
Well,
maybe now you can appreciate their artistry.
You know what? I do. Because let me tell you something. It is not easy to copy and paste audio recordings. I'm not being sarcastic.
We also had so many likes on our Instagram announcement that we have rebranded our podcast.
Yeah, we were a little bit late on the Instagram announcement, but very excited to see so many likes, so many positive comments from Rimple, Chandi, Esther, Malvika, Kelly, Bincy. I love this comment from Sarah. She said, "This is awesome, you guys. Well done. I love this podcast and the vibe. This change just feels right. I heard so much passion in both of you when you spoke about quote unquote other ways of reaching financial goals." Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you everybody who commented. We're so excited about the rebrand. Obviously, you can see, hopefully on your podcast player, our beautiful new green logo, Build a Wealthy Spirit. And guess what? You can even go to buildawealthyspirit.com, leave a comment for us. Let us know what you think. We got a whole website that is here for our community now. So follow us there. You can get our show notes, comment, and a little bit of a recap of the episode. Another shout out to my friend Irina. She has a newsletter, The Boonly. She launches it every Sunday. It looks beautiful. It's all about ways to help yourself grow, and she asks people to share their Sundays. And I am sharing my Sunday with her, so subscribe to her newsletter and you will see a little peek at my Sundays.
And most importantly, be sure to join us next week as we put down the rulebook and we rethink the status quo.